This is Democracy Watch. Mark, we have a major rift that's opened up between federal judges and the U.S. Supreme Court. Can you explain what just happened here?
Yeah, this is really unprecedented. A group of federal judges have told NBC News that they feel abandoned by the Supreme Court. They feel like they have been left hanging out to dry. They are trying their best to follow the law as the Supreme Court interprets it. The Supreme Court's not giving them much to go on in a lot of these short shadow docket rulings. And meanwhile, these trial judges are facing death threats, are facing all kinds of attacks. And they feel like the Supreme Court justices, including the Chief Justice, don't have their back. They are particularly upset by a comment that Justice Gorsuch made when a lower court judge was trying to interpret in good faith, how to interpret these cryptic shadow docket rulings as it related to the firing of FTC commissioners. And Gorsuch basically accused the trial judge of deliberately not following the Supreme Court's prior rulings. And that seems to have particularly irritated this group of judges. This is a big deal for people who care about the fair administration of justice.
To what extent do any of the lower court judges have any impact on what the Supreme Court can do? And I ask that because it very much feels like the Supreme Court is not bound by anything, really. I mean, like you'll hear this, and unprecedented though it may be, and really the Supreme Court, it seems, can just ignore it and there be zero recourse whatsoever. Like, so to what extent do they have to even worry about the rest of the federal judiciary?
Well, so there's a couple of answers to that. I mean, you're right. I mean, technically, Supreme Court doesn't have to answer to anyone, right? It doesn't have to answer to lower court judges for sure. But, the Chief Justice, his job is to oversee the entire federal judiciary. And part of that job historically, and I think even recently, has been the Chief Justice standing up against attacks on the judiciary, not just attacks on the Supreme Court, but attacks on the federal judiciary as a whole. So I think that Chief Justice Roberts has shown a willingness, and I think really needs to do so here, to show that he is looking out for not just his 8 fellow Supreme Court justices, but also all the Court of Appeals judges and the trial judges as well. The other thing is that, the trial judges are not trying to defy court orders. I mean, it's rare, in my experience, to be before a trial judge of any ideological persuasion, whether I think they are, got the law right or wrong. It is rare to find one that is, that you would say is trying to, quote unquote, defy a Supreme Court opinion. They may distinguish them, they may be confused by them, they may get them wrong, but I think that's particularly strong language. And I don't know whether Justice Gorsuch meant it to land as hard as it did, but it clearly landed really hard. And what that means, Brian, is that these judges can react in one of two ways. Neither of which are good for the administration of justice, and frankly, neither of which are good for the Supreme Court. The first is they can just start to pull their punches and say, you know what, I can't make heads or tails with the Supreme Court saying, so I'm myself going to write opinions that are less categorical, that are more, cryptic. And that's not good for anyone. And it actually doesn't help the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court usually wants the lower courts to percolate up these issues. And that requires the lower courts to sometimes stake out positions that turn out to be wrong, but which in the process of staking out these sharp opinions helps the Supreme Court do its job. The second thing, which I don't think, is likely to happen in the near term, but you could also have district court judges saying, if we're going to get criticized anyway, I'm just going to rule how I want to rule. And then you do start to get trial judges that are not paying attention to what the Supreme Court is saying. I mean, in other words, if you're a lower court judge and you feel like, you know what, I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't, then at some level you set up a incentive structure where maybe they do start to say, I don't care what the Supreme Court thinks. Like I said, that has not been my experience with federal judges. I don't think we're any place near that. But I think that these are all good reasons for the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice in particular to be cognizant of the pressures that Donald Trump is putting on these judges.
To what extent do you think it's important that lower court judges speak out in the event that the Supreme Court continues to kind of act as an arm of the White House? Like, They can do that, and absent any pressure from these other judges, really they would feel like it's all good because they would get pressure from Trump otherwise. Now they're not getting pressure from Trump as they continue to kowtow to him. But to what extent is it actually impactful that these lower court judges put the reverse kind of pressure on the Supreme Court not to do whatever Trump does, not to respond to these shadow docket rulings, not to just blindly discard precedent in deference to the White House? Like, how important is it that we continue to hear from these other judges, unprecedented though it may be?
Yeah. So look, I think you make a good point, which is that every federal judge, regardless of the court they sit on or the level of court, they are all nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. And therefore, they are all, in some sense, equal in terms of their ability to speak out. They're not equal in terms of the bindingness of their decisions, right? The Supreme Court's decisions bind all other federal courts, and trial judges don't have that. But if you're a trial judge in Massachusetts, confirmed by the Senate, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, you have life tenure. And, you can only be removed through impeachment. And that is, by the way, the same standard if you're a Supreme Court justice. You have life tenure and can only be removed through impeachment and conviction. So in that sense, I think that these trial judges should feel like they can speak out, respectfully, and obviously they have to follow the law in their decisions. But if they have concerns about how they are being treated as judges, if they have concerns about whether or not they are being treated fairly and their interests being protected, that's something that trial judges should feel the ability to speak out on, or Court of Appeals judges as well, because that's their right as people who have taken an oath of office, and they have taken the oath of office to uphold the laws and the Constitution of the United States, and that is their independent oath. And so, I think that they should not be as silent as maybe in the past they have felt that they have to be. We're in an era of a lot of norms changing. And, this is one of those norms that trial judges follow that maybe it's time for them to revisit, because it may put some pressure on different parts of the system, both the Supreme Court, but other parts of the system as well, to have the back of these trial judges who are doing the day-to-day work. I mean, we had a situation recently in Washington, D.C., where, the administration was going to try to ship children out of the country in the middle of the night. And a trial judge had to get up at 2 a.m. to block that from happening.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole question of why the administration was trying to front run this federal judge. But, these judges are under a lot of pressure.
We so often hear from folks like John Roberts, the Supreme Court's Chief Justice, that the reputation of the court is a priority for him. How important do you think that is at a moment like this? Because we do see so much of what these Supreme Court justices do undermine our faith, our collective faith in the court. And so when we hear him say stuff like that, like we have to take these steps because the reputation of the court would be harmed otherwise, how much stock do you actually put in that versus him just saying something that he clearly has no interest in backing up by virtue of his actions?
So I think it's complicated. I mean, I think that there is, in the abstract, I think the Chief Justice means it. I mean, I think that the Chief Justice has an interest in the courts being respected and has an interest in them being viewed as legitimate and the final word on legal issues and treated with deference. Like, he has all of those interests. The problem is that when those come into conflict with the outcomes of individual cases. I mean, I strongly believe that the decision by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade and all of the decades of precedent upon precedent upon precedent that had been put in place there has done damage to the legitimacy of the court in the minds of millions of Americans. And John Roberts can lament the result of that, but he can't disclaim his role and the court's role in the event that caused it.
Right.
And I read something, yesterday about Donald Trump trying to essentially blackmail the Supreme Court. And it's the particular case they're talking about is the tariffs case. But the assumption of this piece, like a lot of what you see written right now, is that the Supreme Court can only stand up for the rule of law against Donald Trump so many times. Like there is only so many times they can follow the law and the Constitution before they provoke a confrontation with Donald Trump that they can't win. And like that kind of mentality is incredibly damaging to the image of the court, because either the court is there to uphold the law and to defend the Constitution, and that applies equally to Donald Trump as it does to anyone else, or they are pulling their punches in some number of cases against Donald Trump because they fear him, and so they have to pick their fight. In that sense, it's no different than watching, John Barrasso and Senator Cassidy, both of whom, by the way, are medical doctors, talk to RFK Jr. in the hearing yesterday, where the way they tried to get RFK to say vaccines are good is by asking him whether or not Donald Trump should win the Nobel Prize for development of Operation Warp Speed, which was the COVID vaccine. I mean, if you're a medical doctor who's in the Senate, you should be able to just say, to Secretary Kennedy, vaccines are good. I know, I'm a physician. And you shouldn't be undermining vaccines. Instead, they have to do this kabuki dance involving praising Donald Trump for the Nobel Prize. Well, if the Supreme Court justices feel like they are kind of in that world in which they have to they have to find ways to rule that won't unnecessarily, in their view, upset Donald Trump, then that's going to really, really undermine confidence in the courts. So, that I think is at some sense at the heart of what these trial judges and others are concerned about, which is that they may be left hang out to dry because the justices are acting, sort of in their political interest.
Right. And look, we have seen that same type of capitulation, not just by the partisan actors, but even the folks who present themselves as these bulwarks against executive overreach. Even folks like the Washington Post, whose own slogan is "Democracy dies in darkness," that's now kowtowing to Trump, all of which underscores the importance of having people in this ecosystem who are actually willing to fight back and meet this moment with the urgency that it deserves. Mark, you're doing exactly that with Democracy Docket. We've spoken about your outlet numerous times. It's an outlet that I use on a daily basis as my resource to figure out what's going on in the courts as it relates to voting rights and on and on. So for anybody who's watching right now, not only to subscribe to this outlet, but also to support the work that Mark and his team are doing, please sign up for Democracy Docket. I'm going to put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.